Welcome everybody. I'm going to stand in the centre so you know I'm official. My name is Simon Mannering. If I've not met you before, I'm the rector of St Andrew's Episcopal Church in Pacific Beach and the director, I suppose it is, of Continuing Education, which sounds a lot more fancy than it really is, representing the School for Ministry. This is a new venture. We have been in our little rabbit warren, which we tend to be as a church, in the Episcopal Church Centre. With no parking. At the Episcopal Church Centre in Ocean Beach. And there are Saturday classes, and this is a new venture of midweek continuing education offerings. Before I introduce this evening's speakers and presenters for this final series this year, we're going to explore something different next year. And the idea is that we want to see what different congregations want to do, or clusters of congregations, and have our faculty come and our guests come to you. So it could be, I mean, of course, we may not be able to offer what you want us to do, but we're going to offer a menu, but that menu could grow, and the best way for it to grow is for you to say, this is something we really could do with exploring as a church. And the idea is that it doesn't have to come from some voice, it maybe will come from some voice, but your voice could be the one that starts that conversation off and saying, I think we should have that. You might want to speak to the clergy person there, you might not. You might just say, you know what, I think we should do it. So we want to really keep our ears open. And I really see this as the beginning of that process to become a learning diocese, a learning community in the broadest sense. So I do encourage you, thank you so much for coming this evening, and I hope for the next 2 sessions after this. It's my great pleasure not to introduce to you, because I think almost all of you know Colin very well. Colin is at St Paul's Cathedral. And you probably know in Colin's background that he has a background and a passion for community organising. And is that voice, the living witness to that fact today at a clergy gathering, that Colin's often a voice to try to remind the church, the clergy in this case, of its vocation to pursue justice in our world. That's an important voice for us to hear, prophetic voice you might say. And with Colin, a colleague is Dinora Reyna, who works with the San Diego Organizing Project. And we're glad that you are expanding our universe this evening, helping us get out of the Episcopal Church little square that will circle, whatever it is, and gain skills and insight from your professional life and your passion. So, over to you. Thank you. And there are refreshments right here within easy reach.
Shall we begin with prayer? The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Loving God, we bless your name for Frances Perkins, who lived out her life that the special vocation of the laity is to conduct the secular affairs of society, that all may be maintained in health and decency. Help us, following her example, to contend tirelessly for justice and for the protection of all in need, that we may be faithful followers of Jesus Christ, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, one God, forever and ever.
Amen. Amen.
So today is the day we honor Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor under FDR, and was instrumental in making Social Security happen, among other big deals, but was a lifelong Episcopalian, so it's something to be inspired by. Could we start by just saying our names and the church we're from? I'm Colin Mathewson at St. Paul's Cathedral.
And I'm Dinora Reyna, and I'm the South County organizer for San Diego Organizing Project.
Anita Bosenic-Turner from St. Paul's Cathedral. I'm Elaine Grable, and I'm from St. Paul's Cathedral.
Jill Sanford, also St. Paul's Cathedral.
Sandy Lawrence in St. Paul's.
Carlos Garcia, St. Philip, Living Grove. Dave Marshall, St. John's.
Debbie Kistler, St. Philip, Living Grove.
And Simon Mannering, St Andrew's Pacific Beach.
Feel free to make yourself comfortable. It looks like some of y'all are a little squished. So whatever you need to do. The camera should be going. Hope you don't mind we're trying to record this, although most of the times the camera will look at a blank screen, but that's all right. And does everyone know where the bathrooms are? Just right down here. Please feel free to get refreshments. Thank you, Dave, for hosting us in St. John's, and Simon for making this possible, the School for Ministry program. So it's something I've been excited about for months, and especially to work with San Diego Organizing Project on the retreat. in my mind, this is a 3-week exploration about one way, and for me, I think a powerful and personally transformative way to live out our faith, to put our faith into action, to live out God's call to love in the world, and that's through community organizing. So tonight's focus is on answering the question, why organize? And our answer is that the church, to be true to itself as a participant in God's mission in the world, must have a public dimension that is about shaping the world around it for the better, for being part of the Spirit's creative work and ushering in God's reign. So I know that's kind of theological jargon. I do also find it inspiring to think in the prayer book, the question about what is the mission of the church. Does anybody know that offhand? I memorized it because I think it's so awesome. The mission of the church is to restore all people to unity with God and each other in Christ. So it's a reconciling sort of mission that, of course, implies peace and justice as part of that kind of reconciling function that the church is called into, which is really God's mission into the world. So again, community organizing is one way to approach that. Much of tonight's class will be led by Denora from the San Diego Organizing Project, and she can tell you more about that organization as we get there. But we're blessed to have you here tonight with us. And but before turning this over to Denora, I wanted to share a little bit of a theological reflection on kind of how to, as we start to think about why organize, to start there. Theological and then personal again. So why organize? Why get involved as a Christian and as a church in the messiness of politics and social change? Hey, y'all. Just getting going, and maybe y'all could hear names too. We're really glad that.
I think we can make room.
Yeah, we have plenty of space here.
Here. Come on, we can put another chair in here.
Good to see you. Do you want to say your name? Kind of what church you're from? We're just kind of going around.
I'm Eric Olson Fernandez, and this is my daughter Donna, and my wife Gloria. We go to St. Paul's. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad you're here.
What's that?
I said we're glad you're here.
Great.
So we're just getting going. So my theological reflection on why organize begins with Jesus and his unrolling of the scroll in the synagogue early in his ministry. I think many of you can recall that passage, but just to kind of help paint that picture. It's a Sabbath day, folks. Most of the men are in the synagogue, maybe the size of this room, and part of the service is reading from the Torah, the sacred scriptures, and Jesus stands up and is handed part of the scroll that's the prophet Isaiah. And he takes the time, and you can just kind of imagine he did this slowly, and finds a particular passage in that scroll. So everyone's kind of waiting, maybe even wondering, I wonder what he's looking for. And he reads this: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to his attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." You can imagine the drama of that. I mean, it's just, first kind of the confusion and curiosity, but just, it would have been hard, I think, to not be moved in some way by, what is this guy doing? Who does he think he is, right? Because part of what happens next is, he says a few more things that really pisses off everybody. But to make that proclamation in a way that identified himself is partly why many of us call this Jesus' mission statement. That's sort of the first kind of public proclamation of who he was and what he was going to do because of who he was. So if maybe we thought of If Jesus' election was his baptism, this would be his inauguration speech. This is the time when he really kind of claims who he is, lays out that vision for what he's going to be about. So Jesus continues to live in this very, very public life. And it happens to be in a time riven with conflict and complex and unjust power dynamics. There were colonizers and subjects, differing religious sects with their own takes on religion, pervasive secular or Hellenistic cultural influence that was competing for the hearts and minds of the young. There were haves and have-nots. And Jesus walked through this land preaching and teaching his own inclusive take on God's love for the Jews and for everyone in the world. He made possible healings and miraculous feedings, miraculous conversions, like Zacchaeus and Matthew the tax collector. And so there's no question, I would say, that for Jesus, his religion was a very public one, which meant that his religious beliefs and actions had a very public and, in fact, political dimension to that, which had very real political implications and consequences, which for him culminated when he did that Palm Sunday procession on a donkey into Jerusalem. I think we all sort of fail to fully be able to comprehend what that statement was that he was making, but probably was the kind of death sentence for him because of what it was saying and claiming about this sort of messianic, political, and kind of religious claim that he was making. So, as Christians, we do our best to follow this man. But what does that mean? How easy it's become for us in this day for our religion to be private, even though his was so public. And I think that that's because so much of our lives and our culture has become privatized now. With the information age and the barrage of marketing, we've become rightfully paranoid of the agendas of strangers trying to sell some product or some idea. So we retreated into our literal and figurative garages. We stepped off the porch where we could take in the neighborhood kids playing in the street and chat with our neighbors. And now one of the few ways left that we can use to communicate and persuade is through personal story. It's one of the few kind of ways we still, I think, can be moved by each other. So just to share quickly mine and my connection with organizing, I think started when I spent 9 months after college in El Salvador. Went down, I was and am socially privileged in a lot of different ways, and wanted to go down to El Salvador and help poor people. And ended up in a rural area in the mountains of El Salvador, which was one of the places where the guerrillas at the start of the Civil War were organizing and kind of came from. And so spending that time down there, really got to learn some of the history and to experience the fruits of at least 10 years of community organizing and community organization. The towns were run by women still, so this is 10 to 15 years after the end of the Civil War, because they were the ones that kept the whole thing going during the Civil War. People, because there really wasn't any government, because kind of the whole society had broken down, folks had to figure out how to make water still come, to still grow food, to protect themselves, to police themselves, to vote and to choose leaders. And so it's the most democratic place I've ever seen. In the most annoying sort of long night meetings of consensus and all that stuff, if you ever experienced that before. And I was experiencing, I was hearing the stories of it and experiencing the fruits of that, watching these amazingly powerful, in the personal, spiritual sort of sense, women especially, still exerting their own influence and identity in these communities, and it was really inspiring to me. And that was part of, I think, what led me to keep following and learning more, following that thread of what community organizing could be back up in the United States. And what's interesting about that is partly what made that happen in El Salvador was an underlying theology, a liberation theology. It said that God actually cares about how people live in this world, not just in heaven someday. And that part of God's dream is that we all live abundant and thriving lives in this world today. So that's, I think, the start of my personal connection with organizing, why I believe in it. And I'm coming only to realize more and more as I jump more into church life, I'm still new as a priest, that really at the end of the day what community organizing about, and I think what it is also to be a Christian is about, starts with love for neighbor in a relationship, because we fight for what we love. And that's really the basis of organizing, is that by those relationships with people that may be different from us, we start to learn who and for what we fight in Christ's name for justice in the world. So it's some thoughts on why we organize, and looking forward to continuing this conversation with Nora, if you're ready to take it from here.
Sure. And I guess before we really get started with more conversation about organizing, I know that a lot of people are from different places, so before we get into my teaching, if we could partner up with someone that you don't know and then answer, why are you here? So aside from Colin telling you to come, or from a flyer, what in your heart or in your faith, or what is it that told you to come here tonight? So look around the room. If it's someone you don't know, we'll take maybe 2-3 minutes, or 2 minutes each person, a total of 5. So just have that conversation and just share with us the reason why we're here. Can we do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Easy.
We all know each other, so we have to start over here. We'll start over here. I might have to start with you. How about that? We'll have to start over here.
Let's do us 3. I can I'll grab another drink.
I've been doing this on this space, and I don't think a better time. But yes, it was
Pero no sé, a lo mejor quizás no echaste, no me and then you got a graphic y me da mucho gusto oh, yes. Pero qué bueno que y de hecho con nosotros estamos con pero de esa manera nuestra vida hacia atrás y estamos pero yo extraño
we get topics, but this is
Well, actually, I heard this is the first time in Hispanic ministry meeting, and it really caught my attention the introduction about community organizing. Usually, people get together to fight for something, and the person that was giving the talk, even though it wasn't about community organizing, she said, what about if instead of fighting, we start organizing to show love and to show support. That was something that clicked right here. Because it's true. Every time we are doing something community-based protest to be against somebody or something. And that shouldn't be the process. I think it should be taking care of each other, taking care of people. You as part of that. You know, I want to outreach. And it doesn't mean that we have to evangelize, just be an example. And then to evangelize without being Christian. And since that time, it's been in my mind that because I really don't know what to do. I guess I'm in the area, or the church is in the area that really needs really interesting and speak to what we do. Maybe something with the homeless, something different. Because that's part of the community. And that's part of the community that needs to be organized. But I don't know how to do it. I've been dealing with our church. I've been dealing with the homeless. John is 32 years old. But he's been around 20 years around the church. Leading the properties. Getting into the bathrooms and spending time there. That finally, it was like, what's going on? So I sometimes, just to give you information, I live in Imperial.
We do. We're very
so I live in the city of Imperial, and I come here on weekends. I came today because I'm really interested. I usually come on Thursdays, so that means it's going to be a long week. But it's something that I want to talk to this guy because he doesn't look like he's dirty. I know this because we have vacant property, and even though we log, close and whatever we do, he opens actually, he told me recently when I took him, because we discovered that he was living in our bathroom, and our bathroom is outside, so it's a little different. We have inside and we have outside. And in one of the outside bathrooms, he was living and he's still there. And then we discovered that, and the vestry decided we need to change locks. We changed locks and keys and still there. So then I decided, okay, go Nancy Collins gave me a wall. That you think probably is the best that you should do something.
No, it's between, it's just going one side and the other.
So anyway, instead of dealing with him and companies and all this stuff that we I decided to approach him. I've been asking him to clean, I've been asking him to do things. But the fact is, he will get in. And you know, as I said, probably he has a drug problem or alcohol problem or something. I know his mom.
Folks, we're gonna move on.
But since maybe it was something that God is telling me.
How did that feel? Was it comfortable, uncomfortable, awkward, fun, interesting?
Very interesting.
Did you meet someone new?
Yeah.
So I'll start off just like calling and introducing myself. Like I said earlier, my name is Dinora Reina. I live in this very, very small part of the South Bay called Nestor. How many of you here know where that is or where that is? I know, it's sad. But it exists. It's right between San Isidro and west of Imperial Beach, south of Chula Vista. So it's right off of Tocayo, the 905 Iris Trolley Station.
What is the name?
Nestor.
Thanks.
So that's the neighborhood that belongs to the city or is part of the city of San Diego, but basically nobody knows where it's at. I lived there for about 10 years. I consider myself a San Diego native because I'm one of those I love San Diego people. I was born in Riverside County, lived there for about 12 years up until I was 12, and then my parents sold everything and we went to Mexico. And I went to school in San Luis Potosí, which is central Mexico, then moved to the border while we were waiting for my parents or my mom's green card to go through. So I was a border kid. There's this term called fronterizos, and I was fronteriza. I went to Catholic private school in Tijuana, where I think I really started creating my own faith. And then when I was 16, came back to the States and finished high school, went to City College. I'm a first generation Latina. My mom is from El Salvador, so it's always interesting to hear about people's perspectives when they go out there. And she immigrated to Mexico, was undocumented in Mexico as Central American, and she also had to flee the war and the violence that she experienced. So I care about organizing because I see everything in the lens of the poor, of the people that are not always privileged. I went to Southwest High School, which is one of the most underserved high schools in Sweetwater School District. The counselor didn't prepare me for college because she assumed since I came from Tijuana that I wasn't planning on going to college. So this work for me has been definitely impacting not just as an organizer, but I come into communities talking about issues that I relate to, issues that my family has lived through. I had undocumented parents up until I was 12, and then I went to UC Riverside, got my bachelor's in Chicano Studies and Ethnic Studies, then went to USF and got a master's in Public Affairs and Politics. So I'm just one of those people, I think, that used education as one of the escapes, or trying to at least prepare myself to be in places where I can talk about. So my organizing has been shaped by that, by experiences in my life. I have a brother who's at UCLA who has been in situations where he's targeted for speaking Spanish, has been violently attacked for speaking Spanish. So these are, when I talk about this, I relate to my own story, to my family's story, and that's why I care. And so then there's faith-based organizing, which I will talk about today. And I'm going to use a board, so I don't know if you want to move over. I'm sure we'll see each other again, and you'll notice that we organize, and we typically draw either stick figures, triangles, circles, pyramids, any type of shape that's not too complicated. That's what I draw. But faith-based organizing is interesting. I am cultural Catholic. I'm always embarrassed to show up to church because I'm the type of Catholic that the priest says, you know, now where have you been? Or it's nice to see you this Sunday or last Christmas. So I'm still working on that. But I say that because 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if someone would have told me you're going to be a faith-based organizer or faith organizer, never would have believed it. But like Colin said, there's one principle that I always go back to when I'm stressed, frustrated, when I have a 60, 70-hour week, and the one principle I always go back to is, who do you love? And faith organizing to me, in the end, aside from politics, from everything that involves the economy, everything that brings down our communities, it comes down to who do you love? This work is really about relationship building, about knowing each other, and about being in situations where when you have to meet someone who doesn't necessarily look like you. And so San Diego Organizing Project works in about 33 faith communities in San Diego County. And there's an actual model and specific principles that we follow that I'll share with you today. So one of the first and one of the main theologians that we really talk about is a man named Robert Linthicum. And his theory on faith organizing, or at least faith formation, he uses the Old Testament to describe it. And in his writing, he talks about, or he at least describes the world as it should be. And he uses the Old Testament to do that. So, and here he goes with one of my shapes. It's going to be a triangle this time. But he believes that religion,
That might work better.
And I have different colors if you need.
okay.
Excuse me, Dave, can you turn down the cold?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay. So for Linthicum, and this is called like the Linthicum triangle, religion intentionally should shape politics. There should be a relationship in the way that politics are shaped. There should be the core values that come from religion. And therefore, the politics then should shape, or at least allow, for everyone to have enough. And so then there's an impact on the economy as well. And then we believe that it's a triangle. It goes around and it goes around. And so when we talk about religion and values really shaping politics, Linthicum believes that in the ideal situation, religion would convert and would create just politics. There would be justice in politics. He believes that in a world where politics then would make sure that the economy is stable, that everybody has enough to eat, that people aren't poor, that people aren't hungry, then there would be stewardship. But we know that doesn't really happen, or that isn't happening now. So right now, how do you perceive, or just in general, what is the view of religion and politics?
Stay out.
Stay out. Well, how else do you perceive it, or how is it perceived?
Separate, right?
It's separate.
Separation of state.
Separation of church and state. And there's definitely some merit to there being a separation of church and state, because the state cannot say everybody has to be a Catholic, everybody has to be an evangelical. People have the freedom to choose their religious beliefs. So there is a merit. However, when it becomes this instead of that triangle, what happens between politics and religion when it just goes this way? When it's a tug of war between politics and economics, what happens? What is politics? What does it do to our values?
It disconnects them from their root.
It disconnects them. You were going to say something?
Well, I just wanted to say the other thing that between religion and politics, is that the right wing of religion has taken over the politics, so it's kind of like skewed. We don't see progressive religion, progressive people.
It's co-opted.
Yeah, co-opted is a word.
And when we hear politics, when we hear both sides maybe, or we hear something from the White House, do we ever hear anything about values? Are values present in politics all the time? We keep them separate, right? So we keep them silent. Can we say that? Religion is typically silenced. And the same way that now if we talk about this, between politics and the economy, what is the relationship between these two? What happens right now?
The strong survive.
The
And the
strong.
poor go off and die.
So the rich.
There's no equality or inclusion. It's a class system, right?
So basically money buys power.
Right.
Money is power. So Linthicum says that at the core of this triangle, they're the prophets. And how do we talk about the prophets? How would we define who a prophet is? What do prophets do?
Tell truth to power.
Exactly. Exactly. Prophets called on people to come to God
Right.
and talk truth to power. So in most faith embedded in our values, we believe that we are called as prophets to ensure that the values are at the core of all three. Because without our values, if values are not at the center of politics, if it's just a tug-of-war between these two, our values will never be represented. So Linthicum believes that as long as we as a church, once the church takes that position as a prophet, as one individual begins to talk about themselves that way as saying, I think that there's something wrong. I think this is wrong. Then we begin to construct the cycle. And so there is at least like an intentional model of how, and I believe we talked about what a healthy congregation looks like. So we said this is all wrong, right? Like this is a tug-of-war, it's corrupt, it's unjust. But what does a healthy congregation look like? So a healthy congregation is made up by 3 parts. And the first part is Sunday services. So it's also religious education, everything involving worship. The second part of it, I'm going to try to make these equal, is charity. Does anybody do any type of charity, or what kind of charity do your congregations currently do?
We support a home in Tijuana for whose parents are incarcerated. So that's one of our...
Great. Anybody else?
The homeless. They help.
What about the church in Lemon Grove? Is there a charity there?
We've done lunches for Friend of Friends. We've done volunteering work for the foot washing, Monday, Thursday. We've collected toys for Polinsky Center. We've collected food for different groups. We do a lot. We do blessings in a bag.
And we know that charity is very much needed, and it is an immediate response to someone's pain. And so the third part of the healthy model is justice. So my director is I don't know, well, once you meet him, you'll know why he's special. It's very special. Kevin Malone has a story that he tells all of us organizers since the very first day that we sit down with him. There's a story about a village in Uganda, and there were these dead bodies going downstream. And so people started seeing them and would quickly grab them and, bury them and give them the respect that they deserved, but they kept seeing body after body come, so every day or every few hours it was the same work. So the town was working together, every church coming together, burying them until someone, and I'm assuming in that time if Kevin was alive it would have been Kevin, who then asked, where are these bodies coming from? So he climbed up to the mountain or wherever it was coming from, and he found that there were people getting killed. But it took that one person to ask, why is this happening? So he uses that story to describe and illustrate that charity are the people that are burying, the people that are going to and aiding the people immediately for an immediate necessity. But then justice is about asking why. Why are these things happening? Justice is about attending to the root of a problem, or if we talk about homelessness, it's about giving people shelter is very important, and there are organizations that do that and do it beautifully. But our job in the San Diego Organizing Project, what we do is we ask politicians, we ask our city council, we ask the board of directors, the board of supervisors, why are there so many homeless people? Who are these people? So we believe in one-on-one encounters to hear people's stories, to really understand the root of the problem. So we want, and typically organizers are also people that just like to ask a lot of questions. So it's about why this, and Colin and I, the personality to just have curiosity is also part of justice, of not being comfortable with a one-word answer. So, like I said, San Diego Organizing Project is a faith-based community organizing nonprofit organization. We at least intend and try very hard year-round to create this circle in congregations. So we don't succeed from one day to another, but we definitely start. Sometimes we go into churches who their charity is huge and their justice is this big. Then we have First UUers where the justice is very big and it's a little more equal, but there's definitely always time to grow. And so what we intend is that if it's this small, it grows and grows and grows until we get at least as close to healthy as possible. We work with about 35,000 families. It's multi-faith, multicultural, multiracial. San Diego Organizing Project is local, but we have sister federations throughout the state and in the nation who do the same type of work like we do. So we are all under the umbrella of PICO, California in the state, and PICO National, which is in the country. And altogether we work with about 1 million families. We do local work in communities. I'm hired as a South Bay organizer, which is why I'm here. I work in National City, in Chula Vista, Imperial Beach, and Nestor now. And so we work on local, but then there's bigger fights in state or national, which we also collaborate with PICO. We, in the past, over 30 years that San Diego Organizing Project has existed, we've been able to create the 6 to 6 program in schools. We fought for minimum wage, affordable housing. 10 years ago, we were able to contribute with the West Side specific plan in National City, and next year they will have almost 200 affordable housing units in the West Side of National City. In Chula Vista, we've done immigration, everything from immigration forums to also just local fights with local communities, neighborhoods. So it's really is very micro level, and then it can turn into anything as long as the imagination is that big. So that's a little bit about who we are, and a little bit about organizing. So anybody here know Saul Alinsky?
Oh, yes.
I see a lot of nods. I had to read him like 4 times in college, so I got to know him pretty well. But Saul Alinsky was, he basically is our godfather of organizing. He wrote the principles for organizing, and there's one principle that I love that says, meet people where they are, not where you want them to be. So I am here, and I even just being in this room, I can feel where people are at, and that's where I can talk about this freely and comfortably, and if you hadn't been who you are, I would have talked about something very different. So we have to kind of just shift and mold into who people are and come into congregations, and if justice is about homelessness in here, or if it's about minimum wage or whatever it is, then we start creating that dialogue about where people's pain is. Well, Saul Alinsky, back in the 60s, really started seeing a trend. So I'm going to back up. In the 1900s, a lot of people started moving out from agrarian settings into cities, into urban cities. So when they got into cities, they started realizing, you know, when I was back home, we had like our town hall, or we had our town, you know, community, and there was always conversations. But they were moving to Chicago, to Baltimore, and none of this was there. They didn't know their neighbors. So then there were organizations or societies like Elks and the Moose and the NAACP, Women Leagues of Voters, who then they began to create those societies in their new cities or where they were relocating. Those societies were able to maintain as mediating organizations for about 60 years. So when they were around, you had ordinary people, you had them mediating, could have been NAACP, it could have been Elks, whoever it was, and then there was like, you know, we're going to pretend this is downtown San Diego, and that's like City Hall and State Building. But the people that belonged to each one of these looked like each other. You know, most than likely, you know, people would look like me, would belong to certain groups, and et cetera, et cetera. So these mediating groups served to make sure that the common person was being represented here. So for the longest time, for the first more than half from the 1900s to 1960, these agencies were very strong and were able to help the ordinary people. But Saul Alinsky started seeing that after the 1960s, these started disappearing. Even the membership decreased over 65%. So then these people started disappearing, and there was just this huge gap between the ordinary person and power, and whoever was making decisions. So then, Saul Alinsky started doing neighborhood organizing, went door to door, you know, had other organizers, and they started rallying people. But then he realized, you know, people don't look like me. They don't really, you know, it was hard to create that relationship when people were so different. And it took him about 10 years to realize that where people were really meeting and where people knew each other and where there was a foundation of relationship building was in churches. So he took the mediating model, the mediating agencies, and turned it into faith organizing. So instead of going neighborhood to neighborhood, so it wasn't just this block, it was St. John's. And then it was, I don't know, Our Lady of Guadalupe. So it was, they started creating, you know, he started creating community building within congregations. So that's how organizing started to develop. John Bauman is a Jesuit priest who started PICO, and then he met somebody, brought him to San Diego, and that's how San Diego organizing was really originated and how it was able to expand into other parts of the state as well. So any questions up until now?
What is PICO?
PICO stands for People Improving Communities Through Organizing. It used to mean something like Pacific West, some academy of something. It was totally irrelevant before. So this is how we were really, the foundation started. And even since the 1960s, when this got established, congregations, even though youth and faith, there's definitely been a decline in participation, congregations are still very strong, and relationships in congregations last people's lifetime. So the way that we think about organizing is meeting people where they're at, and if the organizing is based around people's values and instilling those into political and public life, that's the way that we move people. That's the way that we organize. Okay, so we're going to go back to why we organize. And there's also another person that we really, really listen to, or we at least follow, and it's Walter Brueggemann. Does anybody know who that is? We see two that say yes. I just started reading on it, so you're probably going to help me out if I get stuck. But he refers to the Exodus story, and that's how he describes the faith formation of people. So when he talks about what people's faith should look like, he turns to the Exodus story. Now I'm going to erase this. And so in the Exodus story, what happens first? Do you remember?
They were captives in Egypt.
They were captives.
They were slaves in Egypt.
They were slaves. And what's the first unjust thing that happens when people started to cry out to God?
Got worse, right?
From what I remember, from what I read, a slave got killed. A slave was murdered. And people, that was the thing that hurt people so much that they started crying out to God and asked him, like, why is this happening? This is not fair. This is not how life should be valued. So the first thing that happened is that people cried out to God. And really what happened was that it was an internal conversation. Colin was asking God, why? We had Dinora asking, but it was an individual conversation. And one of the PICO principles and Solinsky's principles that we listen to or that we follow is the first revolution is internal. So in order for someone to understand or to admit that something was wrong, it had to come from within, and they had to believe that something was wrong. It wasn't because Sandy told me it was wrong and then we talked about it. It was because I think it's wrong. So the second thing that happened is that there was a public processing of pain. And what that means is that then I went to Colin or to Sandy and said, hey, this isn't okay. I think that there's something wrong. And then Sandy said, you're right. So then we had a conversation about, can we do something? This isn't the world or the kingdom that God created for us to live in. We're not all being loved as all of God's children. There's a problem. So
Sounds
then
like
it became
Baltimore.
Exactly. Do you want to say a little more on that?
Well, I mean, the injustice of people getting killed, wrongly getting killed, no accountability, nobody's held accountable for it. Then people going from just the family to the community saying, we're all experiencing this, and we're not just experiencing here, but all of the United States. So then it becomes a movement, yeah.
Exactly, and that's a perfect example. So what happens here is that people start telling each other their story. They say, I am a Latina woman, and when I am down near the border, I get harassed all the time, and then my sister Sandra comes over and says, hey, when I was there, I got pulled over by, Border Patrol also and was questioned. And then we start seeing we both think there's something wrong, and we both have similar experiences. And this is really not only admitting to each other or sharing stories and in organizing, we call them one-to-one. And one-to-ones, we really mean that it's a deep, intentional conversation between two people. But then it's also creating a critique of the world. So it's a sharing of an individual person's story, and then it's also admitting or acknowledging that the world is not how it's supposed to be. There's something missing, or there's something wrong. And the third part that Brueggemann talks about is the release of social imagination. And what happens here is that those two people start creating their own world, or start creating a new world, a world where we're all God's children, a world where the center of the pain, or at least the center of the solution, is our values. And what do your values say about what's happening in Baltimore?
It's wrong.
Well, it's, I like the sign I saw, this is not a riot, this is a revolution. So I thought, people are standing up and saying, this is wrong. We want justice, we want it to stop.
So there's an acknowledgement that there's something wrong, but then there's also a need, like a necessity, to change it and to make things better. So those two people then are joined by other people. And then it really, this is the place where we give rise to imagination and to vision. We see a problem, and it's in the third step, the third part of the Exodus story that we see presented in our life, that we're able to create solutions to those things that hurt us. Without crying out to God, without the first internal revolution, and without then talking to folks, relating to people, and having a public process of pain, we can't get to number 3. So sometimes, and I've seen it done even when I started, especially when I started, I tried to do it backwards. I tried, let me try to get 20, 30 people to care about homelessness, and then we'll deal about the other 2. But as long as the first thing that needs to happen is one person needs to say, one at a time need to say there's something wrong. And when you've achieved all 3, according to Brueggemann, that's true faith formation. That's real faith. Kevin also, my director says, or keeps saying to me, the faith without works is empty. So if we don't see, and we talked about putting faith into action, the notion of really, really wanting to see a change in the world or in our local community, but at the source, at the foundation, knowing that it's because God says that we're all His children, that we all deserve His love. We all deserve a place to sleep and food to eat. And if we don't see that, and if we don't, and in order for a congregation to be healthy, to feel like it's a mediating agency, then there must be at least a process of those 3 steps. And so, lastly, I wanted to make it a little more personal and just hear a little bit about what you're experiencing now, what you see in the world. What's happening in the world, or what in the world right now do you that you see as a problem? It can be local, it can be in Baltimore. What's happening in the world that you say, this is not okay, this is wrong? What are the injustices that you're seeing in the world?
Wage inequality.
Anybody else? Dave, what are you seeing as an injustice in the world?
Well, I was thinking, where is justice? And because I see a lot of inequality and a lot of injustice. So, specifically in California or our country? Or?
I think it depends on how you perceive as your world. So you can be very selfish like me and think it's San Diego, but it can be as big as you want it to be.
Right. I'm really worried about, actually about education and,
okay.
and the process delivery. And that.
Okay.
I was listening to a song by an angry British musician on the way down the freeway. It's perfect freeway music. And he has a line, it's money's ugly confidence. And it seems to me that we've always had that problem, but that we have really made human life cheap. That we'll discard it, there's no irony, it would seem to me, and I don't mean this to disparage Warren Buffett or anybody else, that we have multi-billionaires who make their billions on the backs of, in the end, into millions of laborers who work sometimes for no wages, if they're in sort of enslaved situations in certain parts of the world. There's no irony to recognize that then they give billions away for charity. And it's sort of this that we're so stuck with money's ugly confidence that we think it really does say something. It's something to be confident about. It should make us, money should make us, it makes more of us than we are. So that for me is a fundamental problem, because we're forgetful that in the beginning God made us. And that's our value. The consequences are they're fatal consequences in the end. And without a sense of the common good, we just discard people like they are, like we discard other things, like paper cups.
Are you talking about capitalism?
Talking
Survival
about
of
a
the
sort of,
fittest, and everybody else can go to
kind of the extent to which that is, it's always been, it's been there, exploitation's there from the beginning, but there's an element to which we've all been co-opted within that system, the accumulation. How is it, I remember preaching to the choir in a music room, but how is it through a Great Recession, the very, very, very wealthiest increased their wealth, not just a little bit, but quite significantly? How is that possible? And we know how it's possible, kind of, but we sort of think, that's such a vast problem. And sort of left with almost a feeling of, this is the perfect evening, because it's a feeling of powerlessness in the face of what would seem like unstoppable power.
My next question, and I want to definitely add to this, was how do you feel when you see this? And I just heard powerlessness is a word. I'm going to write it down because I'll probably forget to come back to it. But this is a very, very important part of why this matters, or why organize, is because when these things happen, there is a sense of powerlessness. But can we add to this list what else is on your heart or your mind? When you go to sleep, maybe not every day, but sometimes when you go to sleep, what's on your mind and in your heart?
For me, it's the violence.
Violence?
Like starting from kindergarten to old age, it's horrible. It's like, that's all we know. We don't seem to have any other way to deal with issues. It's like, healthcare.
Healthcare. I hear some people talk about homelessness.
Sexual
Well, you can talk
exploit-
about housing. Housing is very much a problem in San Diego.
Housing.
Sexual exploitation of young people. It's horrible, horrific.
And to the people that spoke about real life situations that are happening now or issues, how does this make you feel aside from powerless? How kind of angry?
Sad.
Sad?
Yeah.
Does anybody feel isolated?
Hopeless.
Hopeless? Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And imagine the world, the kingdom that God intended for us, that He created for us. What is that like? You feel free to just share. What is that in your mind right now? What is that like?
On country trees, birds singing, fragrant air, running water, sounds, nature.
Nature.
People, laughter, lots of eating. Children. Farms.
Farms. And is it a place that's peaceful?
Yes.
There's peace. Is there love in this?
Equality.
There's equality. So if you look at this list, and we look at this list, when we talk about the real situations and real life hurting us right now, they're issues, they're specific things. And when we talk about this, and let's talk about equality and openness and just nature's gifts, laughter, peace, love, these are all values. These are just, first of all, they're moving values, but second, they're also values that we believe as human beings, as God's children, should already exist. And in organizing, we believe that there should be a bridge between these two. A bridge where we bring in the values so that we no longer feel this, but it's a bridge that's created by people. And like I said before, in that bridge, we believe that it's through relationship building, through one-to-ones, that we're able to understand, first, if we are all coming from the same place of values, then we're probably going to talk about those issues that we're all feeling, that we're all hurting. And it helps us then get to a place that's closest to the kingdom. There's the two commandments that I was talking, or Kevin was helping me really wrap my head in why it's the most important thing. And aside from who do you love, there's two commandments, and it's love thy neighbor and love thy God. Those are the two things that we need to remember when we come together next week and the next 2 weeks. If there's anything that we talk about, it goes back to those two commandments. When I don't know who Sandy is or who Colin is, I'm not going to feel what he's feeling or what they're feeling. I'm not going to feel their isolation or the powerlessness that they feel until I know their story. And I believe it's a study done by the Public Health Department that Kevin shared with us recently, that a person who quits smoking and a person who joins the PTA, they saw a health increase that was equally the same value. So that he then went on and on, but our conclusion was that someone who begins to relate to people or is in a setting where they're building something together gets rid of the isolation. So there's clearly negative effects to feeling isolated, to feeling powerless. There's, mental health issues that go with it, and we're not used to doing this. When's the last time that when we walked up to someone and said, "Hi, how are you?" did we really stop and ask them, "How are you?" It's not in our nature, like you said, it's not an American culture for us really to take the time to ask questions. And if there's one thing that I want you to leave today remembering, is that really organizing and faith organizing is a creation of relationships with people who look like you and people who don't. And then it's giving each other the opportunity to share stories and to really feel each other's pain and feel each other's love. So I'm going to leave it at that. So today we talked about why organizing, why we do it, but then why it was created. And then the next time we'll really talk about how and dig a little bit more deeper into the model of how it works. There's a specific process and model. But I definitely hope that I was of some insight tonight. Before we go, I don't know if I want to ask if anybody has questions or comments.
And maybe I'll talk about it next week. And if so, then I'll wait for the commercial break. So when you asked about politics, my undergraduate degree is in political science, and I have a graduate degree in religion.
Okay.
The two things nobody wants to talk about.
Yes.
I guess just money and sex would be the other two things I should get degrees in. But I was interested in the silence when you asked about politics, and when you asked about values, and when you asked about religion and that type of stuff. I was really interested in the silence in the room because that says a lot. And I was trying to think with my own congregation here about how loud that silence would be. if I ask. And mostly it's because they're like, I don't want to upset anybody else. It's just, it becomes so instantly inflamed that they just don't want to talk about it, which is one of the great ways to get us not to do anything.
Exactly.
So, are you going to talk about strategies of how to do that?
Yes, and I think, and it's not just for, I don't use it just as a go-to, but when we talk about relationship building, I think that's where we really then take the conversation about why there is that silence. And then there is a political analysis of why things are the way they are. But we try to at least start at people's values to take them to that process. Because then we also don't want to go into a setting where we show up talking about politics and then not intentionally start at the focus, which is people's values. But in reference at least to Chula Vista, and I talked about Nestor when I asked who knows where Nestor is, like you said, silence. There are, especially the south of 8, there's cities like Chula Vista, like National City, Imperial Beach, who aren't part of San Diego City, and who are neglected cities, and who are cities that make decisions on their own or separately. Some people don't even know that they're not part of the city. So they have no idea, and then they go try to vote for David Alvarez and then realize, wait, I don't even live in San Diego. I've had a lot of people tell me that. So it's definitely, and I will say this now for South Bay, for people, especially if you're here in Chula Vista, I will be the first to admit it's a very different experience. If you're closer to City Hall in downtown San Diego, you mostly know what's happening. For the most part, you know what's going on, you see people, you hear. But down south, it's a slightly different, unique story. So, I don't know, Colin, if you wanted to
I
add.
was going to say, I've been thinking about that a lot lately too. And I've been getting frustrated as I've started to kind of think, okay, I've been at the cathedral like a year and a half now that I've started finally revealing what I really care about, which is this community organizing stuff. I didn't want to scare people too early. And as I've started to slowly kind of throw some things out at chapter or governing board about kind of some policy stances we would take on fracking or Proposition 47. You know, we kind of keep getting shot down on sort of different sort of lawyer sort of reasons or whatever. And I realized that I think partly, at least for congregations like ours, that are made up of a lot of folks who are socially privileged, politics is something that we can take or leave, because it doesn't affect me if the minimum wage goes up or not. You know, like at the end of the day, like, so politics is a hobby, sort of like if I go swimming on Wednesday nights or something, you know, like, and that means, you know, and we're all entitled to our own opinion, and it's something you can have or not, and that's why it's rude to try to convince someone to do that. As rude as it would be to say, stop swimming on Wednesday nights, you should play golf or something, you know, it's just something that we can have or not in our life. And I think that's why I'm struggling to try to figure out, and I'm not a patient person, and I hope God will help me with that throughout my life, but I think almost I'm trying to kind of, I would love the cathedral to get involved with SDOP, but I wonder if it's still preliminary, because I think the real work we need to do is get people to have the internal revolution of number one. And it's, I think that starts with people having relationships with people who are struggling with the system, that people like me are not struggling. I'm having a great life right now. I mean, I really am. Like, I'm so privileged in so many ways that unless I'm actually meeting people and getting to know them and figuring out a little bit what it's like to be them, I don't really, like, it is just like something I can do or not, you know? And so trying to think how to do that effectively in cathedral, in congregations like the cathedral, to get people to have that first internal revolution is a hard one. And I think most of us are here because we've already had that experience. But, you know, it takes a while.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about it in 2 ways. I know that there's definitely places where it takes that relationship building to understand that there's something wrong for that internal revolution to happen. And then there's another type of congregation where people start realizing that their own life circumstances are other people's circumstances. So then they start moving because they want to create a better life for themselves. So, and those type of congregations, I think, are the ones that we talk about justice, and sometimes the honest answer to why we don't do justice, and or I'll just ask it first, why do you think some congregations or most congregations don't do justice as well as they do charity or worship?
I think what Colin just said, that they don't feel the pain.
They don't feel the pain?
Their life is good,
Exactly, yes.
economically,
Yes.
socially.
And then for the congregations that I was talking about who themselves are impacted, they don't know how. Some people just, first person to say, if I would have been told, Leonora, can you change the situation at Sweetwater High School District, I was like, yes, and I would have probably showed up and tried to say one thing and then felt powerless and gone home, probably cried a little, and never tried to do it again. But I don't know how to do, I don't know what to do when you say let's do justice. I don't know how to do it. So I think that's a lot of the big problems in most congregations, but there's definitely, I think, a very powerful position for places like St. Paul's, the places where people who don't look like me, who look like most of you, that will say, Leonora, I feel your pain, and I will walk with you in your pain, and let's make something happen, let's change it. So in some settings it'll vary, and but I think it is a place of a lot of love and beautiful transformation to see someone like Colin and myself working on changing legislation. Because I can come and say, immigrants or immigrant parents deserve to be in this country, and they'll say, yes, sure, another brown short girl that comes and says the same thing. But I bring Colin next to me, who's like 2 feet taller than me, and doesn't look like me, to say the same thing. It unites people, but it also impacts the people in power. So I think that it's a hard thing to do, and in some settings, I will say it's easier to move people who are willing to listen and love the person even though they're not like them, than to try to convince someone that justice is real and that they have the capacity to impact it or to implement it in their church.
So overall, most of your congregation, number of congregations are not the cathedral congregation.
Yes. And we wouldn't be able to do the work we do or win like we do without places like the cathedral. Definitely.
I think there's another reason why they may not see it as, they may not be worship, charity, but not justice, is that they haven't heard that that is at the center of things.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
They've heard something else. I mean, it's so refreshing. It is like a glass of that cool ice water to be here this evening, having spent a day, living this disparagingly really, but with my clergy colleagues, and the focus of our time really was around an anxiety that churches might close.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just actually a lot of anxiety in the end, like just things, and it's, it's like, I don't know what it is, the equivalent of painting a portrait of the city while Rome burns. I mean, in the sense in which the church leaders, the church itself has become comfortable with itself for about half a century, really comfortable. And now it's figured out, oh, people don't like us as much anymore. Oh, shoot, what are we going to do now? And let's talk a lot about what we're going to do now about people not, and I mean people not coming to church. Well, the same issues, that same time period where we've sort of seen this slow decline of the church, as you described, that those that were the brokers or the mediators to represent the rights of the disenfranchised to the people in power also evacuated. I mean, it's the decline of volunteerism. But I feel that as a church leader, I and my brothers and sisters have not said, this is primary, this is essential. And that there's an element to which, I'm not saying in the middle of the cathedral sermon or St. Andrew's sermon you say, stop, talk about something that matters, but maybe it's something like that.
Why wouldn't you say that?
Well, go for it.
Oh, for God's sake. I mean, really, honestly, I mean, how many of you all spoke from the pulpit about the minimum wage? How many of you talked? You can talk about Todd Gloria trying to get a minimum wage. That is not endorsing Todd Gloria. I think the major problem, I'm from the South. We ask questions, we preach from the pulpit. Politics is everywhere. It is a blood sport. We love it. So I don't understand what has happened to the churches. The idea of the separation of church and state has to do with institutions. It has to do with institutionalized religion. It does not have to do with belief or faith, regardless of your being Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever. So there's nothing wrong with having this discussion from the pulpit. And you can discuss policy issues till the cows come home. And look what the African American churches did in the South. They changed the whole South. It all came from the pulpit. And so far, I don't remember the IRS investigating them. I guess the FBI. Just the FBI. So I don't understand the fear, because that's what this is. I do understand what she's saying, though. She says that fear goes away when we are in a group and we talk about it. Fear goes away because when there is more than one, when there are 2 or 3 of us gathered together, yes, we're probably going to have a glass of wine too, but fear goes away. And that's the backbone of what happens here. And not just that the people that you'll be organizing with will be different, which in many cases we hope to God they are, but that those people that Colin is discussing, all of whom I know because they're on chapter, the question has not been presented to them correctly. This is God's business. This is our business. This is the business of the church. And we have the numbers. The cathedral's full.
And one of the biggest fears really is that a person feels like they can't do this alone. So like I said earlier, personally, they're struggling economically, the blame is on me. And there's this American culture thing that everybody pulls themselves up by their own bootstraps. If you work really hard, I promise you'll come to the United States, or if you were born to a generation, everybody will succeed as long as you work hard. And there's this notion of equality versus equity, where if Colin and I are next to each other, we're told to climb onto a tree. First of all, my fit level I would probably pass out before I even got to the tree. But Colin is like 2 feet taller than I am, so he could quickly climb up that tree and win. But if they were to say, hey, let's quiz and see you guys who's better at straightening your hair, then I'd probably win, right? So there's definitely an inequity of where people begin and where they end or what they obtain. And there's this American notion that as long as you all start at the starting line, you'll get to the finish line at the same time because everybody has the same. We're all the same. But in reality, there are social disparities, there are barriers that do not allow for that to happen. So there's also that notion that if it's just me, then I just need to keep working harder. I'll have 3 jobs, and then my children are home alone. Then I can't I'm not part of the PTA, and I'm not part of, I don't know what he's doing in school. My child feels neglected or is always home alone. He turns to the neighborhood park, and then has friends who are also alone all the time, and there's circumstances that occur, and for people who are working class people will understand that it's a reality. Kevin also says, you guys need to meet him, if you're not at the table, you're part of the menu. And I think that's one of the hardest things to understand too, is that if you want to be part of the menu, then all right, then let's just go home. But if you're willing to be a part of the table, you have to be willing to have conversations. And like you said, for some people it's natural and it's second nature to show up and say, this is wrong, let's talk about mass incarceration and immigration. For other people, they might be undocumented. They might have a record. And that record means they can't rent an apartment, they can't get food stamps, they're back to the street, they're back to dealing drugs, and it becomes a cycle all over again. So there is like a level of inequity that we talk about a lot, and it's recognizing that that exists.
Well, you can't get food stamps in San Diego County anyway. The county board of supervisors isn't gonna allow it. So even though that's federal program, that's just one of my things.
All right, folks,
It's
well,
almost, yeah, that time. Anything else before we close in prayer?
Well, I just wanted to respond to what I heard Dave saying. I think that as ministers, we have to change the picture of who Christ was. We think of him, oh yeah, he's wearing this suit and he never makes waves. It's just a complete opposite. He was making waves everywhere. He was turning things upside down. And maybe it's kind of like we need to emphasize that. Con, what was the book that we just read? I think that Phil something about the real Jesus. Anyway, we just did a fantastic study and it emphasized that. It's a book. And it was written 50 years ago. I was shocked when you get into it and you go, oh, this book is 50 years. And you go, wow. And it's like a whole new vision of who Christ was. And, he was moving people. He was putting himself out there, against all the prejudices of the day, all the limitations that were put on people. He's, forget it. It's love, it's acceptance, it's, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the book. But I'll bring it next time. Fantastic book.
We'll keep the conversation going, so looking forward to seeing you next week. Let's stand and do a closing prayer. Maybe we can all hold hands. Let us pray. Thank you, Lord, for bringing us here tonight, and help us be open to the way that your Spirit is leading us into places that might bring us out of our comfort zone, but may also be leading us closer into your life of justice and peace. May we have the courage and be willing to try this new approach to living out your love in the world. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Have a good night. Blessings.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.